All right, so today we're going to be diving deep into a story that I think really highlights the tension between activism and international law and the fight for conservation. It's the story of Paul Watson, the founder of Sea Shepherds, and his recent release after being detained on an Interpol red notice.
Yeah, it's a case with so many layers, and I think what's really fascinating about it is that it opens up this much bigger conversation about, how we protect our oceans in a world that has so many competing interests, and sometimes even like conflicting laws.
Yeah, for sure. So we've got a really interesting mix of sources for this deep dive. We've got news articles that sort of detail the events as they happened, briefing documents that outline the legal complexities, and even some direct quotes from Watson himself. And let me tell you, some of this stuff is pretty wild.
Oh, absolutely. The fact that Watson spent his 74th birthday in a Greenlandic prison, that's just the tip of the iceberg. There are allegations that Japan was using trade pressure to influence extradition decisions. There are whispers of political maneuvering within Interpol, and even a glimpse into the daily life of a controversial activist behind bars.
Yeah, behind bars. So speaking of controversial, I think it's important to start with a little bit of background. On Paul Watson himself. He's not exactly your average environmentalist. He began his activism with Greenpeace, but eventually sort of went his own way. Founding Sea Shepherd, an organization known for its the very direct approach to stopping whaling.
Yeah, he definitely doesn't shy away from confrontation. And he even describes Sea Shepherd as an enforcement organization rather than a simple protest group. He operates under this philosophy he calls aggressive nonviolence, which is a term that certainly raises some eyebrows.
I was going to say, aggressive nonviolence. That's an interesting juxtaposition. So how does that actually play out on the high seas? What are we talking about here in terms of Sea Shepherd's tactics?
Well, they've been known to use a variety of methods to disrupt whaling operations. Things like intercepting whaling vessels, using projectiles to damage ships, and even boarding whaling ships to try to stop them directly. They claim these actions are necessary to uphold international conservation laws, especially when governments are failing to do so. But obviously, these tactics have landed them in hot water legally and sparked debate about, where to draw the line.
Between activism and vigilantism.
Right, yeah, because, at a certain point,
yeah,
you are sort of taking the law into your own hands. And that brings us to the heart of this case, the incident that led to Watson's arrest. So back in 2010, there's this confrontation between a Sea Shepherd vessel and a Japanese whaling ship. That resulted in Japan issuing an Interpol red notice for Watson, leading to his detention in Germany. And eventually this whole ordeal in Greenland. Right, and what's particularly interesting about this case is that it raises these questions about the potential for abuse within the Interpol system itself. So these red notices, while they're intended to apprehend, serious criminals, have been criticized for lacking proper oversight and potentially being used for political purposes. And Watson claims that the charges against him are totally trumped up, motivated by Japan's desire to silence a vocal critic of their whaling practices.
And that claim gains some weight when you consider that Japan has been publicly condemning Watson and Sea Shepherds for years, often framing them as eco-terrorists. There's a definite history there. That adds another layer of complexity to this whole situation.
Yeah, and it's a history that intersects with another fascinating aspect of the story, which is the role of media and public perception. So remember the show Whale Wars? That series really brought Sea Shepherd's activities into the spotlight, showing those high seas confrontations and showcasing Watson's uncompromising approach.
Oh, yeah. I remember that show. It was pretty intense. It definitely brought the issue of whaling to a wider audience. But it also fueled the controversy surrounding Sea Shepherd and their methods. So do you think the show played a role in Japan's pursuit of Watson?
It's hard to say for certain, but it's definitely something to consider. Japan was certainly facing increased international scrutiny because of the show, so it's possible they saw a sea going after Watson as a way to push back against that negative attention.
Yeah.
And try to discredit Sea Shepherd in the public eye.
Yeah, it's interesting because it really does feel like Watson became this lightning rod in this whole debate over whaling. So let's talk about what happened. After he was apprehended in Greenland, what was his experience like in that prison? And how did this whole situation unfold from there?
Well, according to our sources, Watson found himself in a surprisingly humane prison. He even had a view of the fjords from his cell. It's a detail that I think many people find surprising, given the circumstances.
Yeah, it does paint a rather unexpected picture of prison life. But there's another detail that really stood out to me, and it almost feels ironic. Apparently, whale and seal meat were available in the prison store.
That is a fascinating detail. It highlights the cultural context of Greenland, where hunting these animals is part of their tradition. However, for Watson, someone who has dedicated his life to protecting those very animals, it must have been a pretty jarring experience.
Absolutely. It forces us to think about the complex intersection of cultural practices, personal convictions, and global conservation efforts. And all of this, while Watson is facing the very real possibility of extradition to Japan, a country where he believes he wouldn't receive a fair trial.
Right, and he's been very vocal about that fear, stating that he believes Japan intends to make an example of him to discourage other activists. So it's a very high-stakes situation with international implications, not just for Watson, but for the future of sea shepherds and the anti-whaling movement as a whole.
Yeah, it really was.
Well,
you've got the fate of this man hanging in the balance. You've got the future of this organization. And you've got this global issue of whaling all kind of coming to a head in this one case. So it's a lot to unpack. And there's still so much more to this story, but we're going to have to take a quick break, and we'll be back in just a moment.
To dive deeper into the next chapter of this deep dive. So we've got Watson facing extradition, stuck in this Greenlandic prison with whale meat in the cafeteria. Feels like something out of a movie.
But while all this legal drama is playing out, something else really remarkable is happening. This wave of international support starts to build for his release.
Yeah, and it's interesting because it wasn't just, environmental groups rallying behind Watson. This case really seems to have captured the attention of a really diverse range of people and organizations. We're talking celebrities, high-profile politicians, even business leaders, all kind of joining this chorus, calling for his freedom.
Right, and we see that reflected in the sources. We've got quotes from Brigitte Bardot, who's obviously been a vocal animal rights activist for decades, and even Emmanuel Macron, the president of France, expressing their concern over Watson's detention.
And it's important to note that these statements weren't just symbolic gestures. They put real diplomatic pressure on Denmark, who, remember, finds themselves in kind of a precarious position here.
Okay, so let's unpack that a little bit. What were the competing pressures that Denmark was facing in this situation?
Well, on the one hand, they have this long-standing relationship with Japan, both economically and diplomatically. They certainly didn't want to jeopardize that by refusing an extradition request. But on the other hand, Denmark has this reputation for upholding human rights and due process and extraditing someone to a country where they might not receive a fair trial. That's a tough pill to swallow for a nation with that kind of image.
It's almost like Denmark becomes this unexpected battleground in this larger fight over whaling. And speaking of pressure, there were those allegations that Japan was using more than just diplomacy to try and secure Watson's extradition.
Right. There were these claims circulating that Japan had threatened to pull out of this lucrative wind farm project in Denmark and even hinted at obstructing Denmark's bid to host a major UN conference. Now, whether those threats were actually real or just rumors is hard to say definitively, but they definitely added another layer of intrigue to this whole situation.
Yeah, it makes you think about the lengths that countries are sometimes willing to go to achieve their objectives on the international stage. It's like this high-stakes game of chess with economic leverage and political influence being used as pawns.
And in the middle of all of this, you have Paul Watson sitting in this Greenlandic prison, but even there, he wasn't exactly staying quiet.
Oh, yeah, that's right. He used that time to write a children's book. It's a fascinating detail.
It speaks to his resilience and his commitment to his cause. Even facing extradition, potentially years in a Japanese prison, he still found a way to channel his energy into something creative and, in a way, hopeful. He wasn't going to let the situation break him.
So after months of this legal back and forth, international pressure, all this behind-the-scenes maneuvering, the Danish Ministry of Justice finally makes their decision. What happens?
On December 18th, 2024, they denied Japan's extradition request. Paul Watson was a free man.
What a moment that must have been. I bet there were some serious celebrations.
Oh, absolutely. We've got photos in our sources of him walking out of that Greenlandic prison, surrounded by his legal team, supporters cheering, and you guessed it, a birthday cake. A little belated, but a nice touch nonetheless.
It's kind of a heartwarming image, a victory for Watson and all those who rallied behind him. But it also raises the question, what does this outcome actually mean? What are the implications for Sea Shepherd, for the anti-whaling movement, and the ongoing fight to protect whales?
Yeah. That's where we need to shift our focus. From the personal story of Paul Watson to the broader landscape of whaling and conservation, his release was undoubtedly a symbolic win, a boost for the morale of activists around the world. But the battle to protect whales is far from over.
A battle that, as we've seen, is being fought on many fronts, in the courts, on the high seas, in the halls of international organizations,
Yeah.
and even in the court of public opinion.
Exactly. And understanding the complexities of this issue requires us to delve into the history of whaling regulations, the role of the International Whaling Commission, and this ongoing debate over the balance between cultural practices, economic interests, and conservation goals.
Okay, so let's do it. Let's dive into the deep end of international whaling regulations. Tell me, what is the International Whaling Commission, and how effective have they been in protecting whales?
So the IWC, the International Whaling Commission, was established in 1946 with the goal of managing whale stocks and preventing overexploitation in the early years. It primarily served the interests of whaling nations, but in 1982, it adopted a moratorium on commercial whaling. That went into effect in 1986.
So did that moratorium effectively end whaling globally?
Not quite. While it significantly reduced the number of whales being hunted, it didn't eliminate whaling entirely. The moratorium includes these exemptions for what's called Aboriginal subsistence whaling, which allows certain indigenous communities to continue hunting whales for cultural and nutritional needs.
Okay, I see. So there are some exceptions built into the system. But what about countries like Japan that have continued whaling despite the moratorium? How do they justify their actions?
Well, Japan has used this loophole. In the moratorium, that allows for whaling for scientific purposes. So they argue that their whaling program is necessary to gather data on whale populations and to understand the role they play in the ecosystem. However, this claim has been widely disputed by conservation groups and many scientists, who argue that the amount of lethal research that Japan conducts is excessive and that non-lethal methods could be used to gather the same data.
So there's a lot of contention around this scientific whaling exception. It sounds like it's become a real point of friction within the IWC and a source of frustration for those who want to see a complete end to whaling. But how does this all relate back to Paul Watson and Sea Shepherd?
Well, I think what's important to understand is that Paul Watson's approach, this aggressive nonviolence of Sea Shepherd, is a direct response to what he sees as the failures of the IWC to effectively protect whales.
So he's basically saying that the current system isn't working, and someone needs to step in and enforce the rules, even if it means taking matters into their own hands. It's a controversial approach, but one that has certainly brought attention to the limitations of international agreements and the complexities of enforcing them.
Exactly. And while Watson's methods have sparked debate and criticism, his case has also highlighted the passion and dedication of those who believe that more needs to be done to protect these magnificent creatures.
So we've got this system of, international regulations, a commission tasked with managing whaling, and yet we still see these countries like Japan finding ways to continue hunting whales. Then you have someone like Paul Watson, who's essentially saying, forget the bureaucracy, I'm going to stop this myself. It's a fascinating clash of approaches, and it makes me wonder, where do things go from here? What's the future of whaling, and what does Watson's release mean for Sea Shepherd's strategy moving forward?
Well, Japan certainly wasn't happy about the decision to deny Watson's extradition. Their foreign ministry issued a statement expressing their deep regret and disappointment and reiterating their view that Watson is a dangerous criminal who should be held accountable for his actions.
So the tension continues, and I imagine the underlying disagreements about whaling haven't gone away either.
Oh, absolutely not. And while Watson's release was a significant victory for his supporters, it also presents some new challenges and questions for a Sea Shepherd. After all, their tactics have now landed their founder in legal trouble on multiple occasions.
Yeah, do you think this experience will make them reconsider their approach, maybe tone down the direct action methods a little bit?
It's certainly possible. They've proven they're willing to push the boundaries of the law, but this case demonstrates that there are potential consequences for doing so. It's a delicate balance. On the one hand, their aggressive tactics have undoubtedly disrupted whaling operations and brought attention to the issue. But on the other hand, they risk alienating potential allies and facing legal repercussions that could actually hinder their long-term goals.
Right. It's interesting to think about how this case might impact the future of Sea Shepherd and the broader anti-whaling movement. It's almost like they're at a crossroads. Do they continue with this high-profile confrontational approach, or do they shift towards a more diplomatic strategy, working within existing systems to try to influence change?
Yeah, it's a question that many activist organizations grapple with, how to be both effective and responsible, how to stay true to their principles while also navigating the complexities of the legal and political landscape.
And it's not just about tactics either. It's also about understanding the deeper cultural and economic factors that drive whaling We can't just assume that everyone who supports whaling is doing so out of malice or ignorance.
Right. In some cultures, whaling is deeply intertwined with tradition and history. And for some coastal communities, it represents a source of livelihood and food security. So those factors need to be acknowledged and addressed, not simply dismissed.
So how do we bridge those divides, those fundamental differences in perspective? Is there a path towards a future where whales are truly protected, where whaling is a relic of the past? Or is that just a utopian dream?
I think achieving that kind of future requires a multi-pronged approach. It requires continued legal challenges to unsustainable whaling practices. It requires scientific research to better understand whale populations and the threats they face. It requires education and awareness raising to foster a greater understanding of the importance of these creatures. And it requires open dialogue and collaboration between nations, even those with differing views on whaling. It's a tall order, but I believe it's a goal worth striving for.
And it's a reminder that this story, this deep dive into Paul Watson and the fight against whaling, is ultimately about much more than just one man or one organization. It's about our collective responsibility to protect the oceans and the incredible diversity of life they contain.
Exactly. And while there are no easy answers or quick fixes, I think cases like Watson's, as controversial as they may be, serve as a catalyst for conversation, pushing us to confront uncomfortable questions and consider new ways of coexisting with the natural world.
Well, I think that's a perfect place to leave this deep dive. It's clear that the fight to protect whales, and indeed the health of our oceans, is an ongoing journey with no simple solutions. It's a journey that involves legal battles, scientific research, cultural understanding, and ultimately a shift in human consciousness.
And I think the most important takeaway for our listeners is this. This journey isn't just for activists or scientists or policymakers. It's a journey we're all on together. And it's a journey that requires each of us to engage, to learn, to question, and to act in ways that support a more harmonious relationship between humanity and the natural world.
So thank you for joining us on this deep dive. We encourage you to explore the sources we've provided, to form your own opinions, and to consider what role you might play in shaping the future of our oceans. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep caring.